There is a moment in every person's day that almost no one notices. It's subtle, nearly silent, and yet it determines whether you will walk through the next hours anchored in God or dragged by the currents of the world. It happens right after you wake up. For a brief second, your mind is still soft, open, uncluttered. There is a natural stillness inside you, a quiet readiness to sense God before anything else pulls your attention outward. But then the day begins. A thought surfaces about something unfinished. A memory of yesterday's stress slips in. A notification vibrates. A deadline flashes through your mind. And without realizing it, you've already lost the clarity you woke up with. This is the invisible noise that separates you from God, long before the day actually becomes loud. Not the noise around you, but the noise inside you, the noise that builds so quickly you don't even recognize it as noise. You simply feel that your connection to God is thinner, distant, harder to access. People often think spiritual distance is the result of failure, weakness, or neglect. But most of the time, it's the overload of micro-stimuli your brain absorbs without your permission. The mind wasn't designed to process dozens of demands in the first minutes of the day. Your nervous system wakes up slowly, cautiously. And when the external world floods you faster than your internal world can stabilize, your attention fragments. Fragmented attention leads to fragmented awareness, and fragmented awareness is the enemy of spiritual presence. God has not moved away. Your mind has simply become too crowded to recognize Him. This is the quiet tragedy of modern life. You aren't rejecting God. You're being overwhelmed by the pace of a world that never stops to breathe. And your soul, trying to stay aligned with Him, gets drowned beneath layers of urgency that look important but cost you something priceless: the ability to notice Him in real time. Every time you rush, react, or multitask before your mind is even fully awake, you train your brain to operate in survival mode. Survival mode narrows perception. It focuses on threats, tasks, pressures. It shuts down the ability to perceive subtlety, beauty, meaning, and especially the gentle movements of the Holy Spirit. When your internal world is agitated, God seems absent, not because He is far, but because your inner signal is being jammed by the constant static of your own mind. And once the static begins, it builds like snow on a windshield, layer after layer, until you can barely see through it anymore. You start feeling spiritually disconnected by noon and wonder why. You blame yourself. You try to pray, but the mind won't quiet down. You try to worship, but your thoughts keep running. You try to focus, but your attention slips like sand through your fingers. It's not that you lack discipline. It's that your brain has been captured by unfiltered stimulation before your spirit had a chance to guide your day. Yet, here lies the breakthrough. What feels like spiritual failure is actually neurological conditioning, and what can be conditioned can be rewired. God never intended you to live reactive, scattered, or spiritually numb. He designed you with the capacity to abide, to carry His presence as a continuous inner state, not a moment that appears and disappears depending on circumstances. You were made to walk with Him through ordinary life, not just during prayer, not only in silence, not only when everything is peaceful. The original design of your mind, of your soul, of your attention is communion. Modern distractions don't remove that design. They simply bury it under layers of emotional and mental clutter. But once you understand how this clutter forms, you can learn how to dismantle it. You can learn how to create space inside you where God is not just acknowledged but genuinely sensed moment by moment. And this is where the day begins to transform. When you discover that abiding in God's presence is less about effort and more about awareness, the entire way you relate to Him changes. When you understand that presence is not something you chase but something you cultivate, peace stops being fragile. It becomes stable. When you realize that God is not waiting for you to escape your responsibilities but wants to meet you inside them, the pressure of the world loses its power to disconnect you. You start recognizing that what separates you from God is not the intensity of your schedule, but the absence of internal alignment. And alignment can be trained. Awareness can be strengthened. Stillness can be practiced. Connection can become your default state instead of an occasional experience. This video will take you through that training. It will show you how to rebuild the inner environment where God is naturally noticed, how to protect your awareness from mental overload, and how to walk through your day, your real day, with real responsibilities, without losing the presence that gives your life direction, clarity, and peace. Today you will learn how to stop drifting away from God unconsciously and start abiding in Him intentionally, continuously, effortlessly, rebuilding the inner sanctuary where awareness begins. There comes a point in every person's spiritual life where they realize something profoundly simple yet deeply ignored. You cannot abide in God if your inner world has nowhere for Him to rest. Not because God needs a place, but because your awareness does. When the mind is chaotic, overstimulated, cluttered, or constantly running from thought to thought, there is no stable ground inside you where presence can settle. And this has nothing to do with holiness or morality. It is about architecture. The architecture of attention, the architecture of perception, the architecture of the inner sanctuary that needs to be rebuilt if you want to stay connected to God throughout the day. Most people try to feel close to God without ever examining what their mind actually looks like on the inside. They want peace without noticing that their thoughts are tangled. They want clarity without noticing that their focus is constantly being yanked away by internal noise. They want presence without noticing that their inner space is full of emotional debris they never learned how to clear. Rebuilding the inner sanctuary begins with recognizing that awareness is shaped by the environment it lives in. If your inner world is filled with mental clutter, unresolved tension, rapid shifts of thought, and an unfiltered stream of stimulation, awareness collapses under the weight of all of it. The mind becomes a hallway with too many doors open at the same time, each one pulling your attention in a different direction. In this state, God doesn't feel distant because He is distant. He feels distant because your awareness has no stability, no anchor, no quiet ground on which to stand. You cannot perceive what you cannot stay still enough to notice, and this is where most people lose God during the day, not in their choices, but in their mental atmosphere. You cannot hold water in a broken cup. You cannot hold presence in a fractured mind. Neuroscience teaches something extremely powerful. The brain is constantly scanning for what to prioritize. Whatever is loudest, whatever is emotionally charged, whatever is urgent, whatever is unresolved, becomes the dominant focus. Presence is gentle. God's voice is subtle. Spiritual awareness usually whispers instead of shouts. So if your inner world is filled with loud, unprocessed thoughts, the whisper becomes easy to miss. This is why you can pray in the morning and still feel disconnected 2 hours later. Your prayer was not the problem. Your mind was not prepared to sustain the awareness that prayer created. No house can stand if its foundation is unstable. No presence can be sensed if the inner sanctuary is in ruins. Rebuilding this sanctuary begins with one essential insight. You must learn to create internal space. Space is the beginning of awareness. Space allows your thoughts to slow down, your emotions to settle, and your attention to stop ricocheting endlessly. Without space, the mind becomes reactive. With space, the mind becomes receptive, and receptivity is the birthplace of spiritual awareness. You rebuild the inner sanctuary by cultivating the mental posture that allows God to be noticed. That posture is stillness, not the absence of movement, but the absence of inner chaos. It is the ability to hold your attention steady for just long enough for your inner world to reorganize itself. Ancient writers understood this long before modern psychology existed. They spoke of returning inward, of retreating into the heart, of building a secret place within the soul where God could be encountered. They understood that spiritual presence is not primarily found externally, but internally, in the place where thought, emotion, and awareness meet. Modern science now confirms what they intuitively practiced. When the mind becomes quiet, the nervous system shifts into a state where perception deepens, clarity increases, and sensitivity to subtle signals expands. This is the state where awareness of God becomes effortless instead of forced. Rebuilding the inner sanctuary is not about trying to think holy thoughts all day. It is about restoring the inner conditions where holy awareness can naturally rise. It is clearing the mental noise that keeps you disconnected, reducing the internal friction that drains your attention, and opening the emotional space where God's presence can be sensed. As this sanctuary is rebuilt, something remarkable happens. Your mind stops fighting itself. Your thoughts stop overwhelming you. The noise begins to fade. Awareness becomes easier to maintain. You begin to notice God sooner, feel Him deeper, hear Him clearer. You no longer have to chase presence. Presence starts to find you because the inner environment is finally prepared to hold it, training the heart for constant God awareness instead of occasional encounters. There is a moment in every believer's journey when they finally understand why their connection with God feels strong in certain moments and fragile in others. It is not because God comes and goes. It is because the heart has not yet been trained to maintain awareness. Most people relate to God in emotional spikes. A powerful moment in prayer, a wave of peace during worship, a sudden clarity when reading a verse. But then, life resumes its pace, and that awareness slowly dissolves as responsibilities, pressures, and distractions regain control of the internal space. And then the person interprets this drift as a spiritual weakness, as if they were incapable of staying connected. But the truth is far simpler. The heart has not been trained. Awareness has not been developed. Sensitivity has not been practiced. You cannot expect stability from a muscle you never strengthened. You cannot expect constancy from a heart that has only known moments. Constant awareness of God is not an accident. It is a trained state shaped through repetition, emotional processing, and intentional alignment. The same way your brain learns to recognize patterns, your heart also learns to recognize presence. But for most people, the heart is conditioned only in short bursts. You feel God during prayer but lose Him during work, because prayer became an isolated event instead of a training ground. You feel close to God during worship, but lose Him during stress because your emotional responses were never trained to stay open to Him while under pressure. Spiritual life becomes inconsistent, not because you are inconsistent, but because the training process has been incomplete. Awareness is a skill, sensitivity is a practice, connection is a rhythm, and like any rhythm, it becomes natural only when it is repeated often enough. In cognitive behavioral therapy, there is a principle that speaks to this truth. The brain follows what you repeatedly reinforce. Whatever becomes familiar becomes easy. Whatever becomes practiced becomes automatic. If you train your mind to turn inward only in moments of calm, then awareness will collapse in moments of stress. If you train your heart to recognize God only in silence, then His presence will seem absent in noise. If you train yourself to connect only when nothing is demanding your attention, then the moment life becomes busy, the connection dissolves. Not because God is gone, but because the heart has never been conditioned to hold Him under pressure. Constant awareness requires a heart that has practiced presence in the middle of real life. This is where spiritual training becomes transformative. You begin by teaching the heart that God is present, not only when you feel Him, but even when your emotions are quiet. You teach the heart that awareness is not emotional intensity, but internal alignment. You teach yourself that the goal is not to feel connected, but to remain open, receptive, attentive. The heart learns through repetition, and each repetition strengthens your ability to notice God with increasing ease. The more you return your attention to Him during ordinary moments, the more natural presence feels. The more you acknowledge Him during simple tasks, the more automatic awareness becomes. The more you practice micro moments of connection throughout the day, the more your heart stays awake even when the world tries to drown it in noise. This training is not dramatic. It is subtle, quiet, almost hidden. It happens in the seconds between tasks, in the moments where the mind wants to drift, in the spaces where you would normally run on autopilot. Every time you interrupt the drift and return your awareness to God, even for a breath, you are strengthening the internal pathways that hold presence. Modern neuroscience explains this through neuroplasticity. The brain rewires itself based on what you repeatedly return to. Every return to God, no matter how small, rewires your ability to remain aware of Him. What begins as a conscious decision eventually becomes a natural reflex. Your heart starts recognizing God without effort. Your mind becomes conditioned to stay aligned. Your emotions begin settling automatically instead of spiraling. Over time, you stop experiencing God in sporadic moments and start living in a state of subtle, continuous awareness. You no longer rely on emotional highs to feel connected. Your heart stays open even when you're busy. Your mind remains anchored even when pressured. Your inner world becomes tuned to his frequency, the way a trained musician hears harmonies others miss. This is the transition from occasional encounters to constant awareness. It is not mystical. It is not reserved for the spiritually elite. It is the natural result of a heart that has been trained to remain with God instead of visiting him occasionally. And once the heart is trained, everything changes. Tasks become lighter because you are no longer doing them alone. Stress loses its control because you remain connected to the one who steadies you. Conversations become deeper because you are listening not only externally but internally. Work becomes purposeful because you feel guided, supported, accompanied. Awareness becomes your state, not your effort. And abiding becomes your lifestyle, not your struggle. Transforming ordinary tasks into spiritual anchors. There is a quiet shift that happens in a person's spiritual life when they finally understand that God is not only found in holy moments. He is found in ordinary rhythms that most people pass through without noticing. Many assume that abiding in God requires withdrawing from life, pausing everything, or separating the spiritual from the practical. But the truth is far more accessible. The deepest spiritual awareness is built through small, repeated, ordinary actions that become anchors for presence. The moments you often consider meaningless, walking to the kitchen, turning on your computer, preparing your workspace, taking a sip of water, can become subtle doorways into awareness when paired intentionally with God. This is not about forcing spirituality into every action. It is about attaching presence to moments your brain already performs automatically, so that awareness becomes natural instead of effortful. Your mind thrives on patterns. It looks for cues, sequences, routines. When a behavior is repeated daily, the brain memorizes it, predicts it, and executes it with less energy. That is why habits become effortless over time. But here lies a profound opportunity. If you attach a moment of awareness to an existing routine, the brain begins to associate that routine with that awareness. Behavioral scientists call this anchoring. Spiritually, it becomes a doorway. Every time you repeat the behavior, the internal association activates automatically. That means you begin creating small silent reminders throughout your day, where awareness of God emerges naturally, without needing to stop what you're doing, without needing a spiritual setting, and without needing emotional intensity. Most people fail to abide in God because they try to create spiritual moments instead of recognizing the ones already available. You don't need to escape your responsibilities. You need to repurpose them. When you walk to your desk, that moment can become a shift of awareness. When you pause before opening an email, your internal world can realign. When you take a breath between tasks, your heart can soften again. These transitions, which the mind normally ignores, become anchors that reconnect you to God in the middle of ordinary life. And this is where abiding becomes sustainable. You stop relying on long, isolated moments of prayer to carry you through the entire day. Instead, the day becomes embedded with dozens of small connection points that rebuild awareness little by little. The beauty of transforming ordinary tasks into spiritual anchors is that it does not add anything to your schedule. It simply changes how you move through what is already there. Every routine becomes an invitation. Every repetition becomes a practice. Every simple action becomes an internal signal that reminds your heart where it belongs. When you integrate God into these small transitions, you begin to discover how to stay connected while living fully present in your responsibilities. You are not dividing your day between holy and secular moments. You are dissolving the line entirely. You are learning to carry God into every movement, every task, every breath. This approach also rewires your emotional responses. When ordinary actions become anchors, you develop micro moments of calm, grounding, and inner returning. These moments stabilize your nervous system, reduce reactivity, and increase your ability to think clearly and act wisely. This is not only spiritual, it is physiological. It changes how your brain handles stress, how your body regulates energy, and how your emotions respond to pressure. Anchors create rhythm, rhythm creates safety, safety creates awareness, and awareness create space for God. Imagine what happens when your day is filled with these anchors. You are no longer pulled randomly by circumstances. Your mind no longer runs uncontrolled. Your emotions no longer swing as dramatically. Awareness becomes woven into your behavior. Presence becomes layered into your routines. The sense of God stops fading as the day progresses, because your entire day now includes built-in moments that call you back to Him. You begin to feel Him not only in prayer, but while washing dishes, while driving, while entering a meeting, while stepping outside for air. The ordinary becomes holy, not because it changed, but because you changed the way you move through it. This is the turning point where abiding in God becomes realistic for daily life. You don't need a monastery. You don't need silence. You don't need to withdraw. You simply need to awaken the sacred potential of your ordinary routines. When the smallest actions become spiritual anchors, presence stops being something you seek occasionally and starts becoming something you encounter repeatedly. And with every encounter, the awareness becomes stronger, steadier, more integrated. You stop drifting without noticing. You start returning without effort. And slowly, almost without realizing it, you begin living the kind of life where God is no longer someone you visit, but someone you carry. The discipline of returning, how to come back to God in seconds. There is a moment everyone experiences, though few ever name it. It's the instant you realize your mind has drifted far from where your spirit intended to be. 1 second you were aware, steady, connected, and the next you're swallowed by a wave of thoughts, impulses, responsibilities, or emotions that pull you away from God, almost without your permission. People often interpret this drift as failure, but it is simply human nature. The mind wanders, the nervous system reacts, the heart gets overwhelmed. Drifting is not the problem, staying lost is. The true secret of abiding in God is not about never drifting again. It is about learning how to return quickly, gently, and consistently. Your power is not in perfect focus. Your power is in your ability to come back. Returning to God is a discipline that becomes easier the more you practice it. At first, your drift may last hours before you notice. Then it becomes minutes. Eventually it becomes seconds, and this shift is not accidental. It happens because the heart and mind learn to recognize the early signs of disconnection. You start noticing when your breath gets shallow, when your thoughts accelerate, when your emotions tighten, when your attention narrows, when your internal world becomes louder than your awareness of God. These signals are not spiritual condemnation. They are invitations. They are the gentle alerts that your inner sanctuary needs to be recalibrated. They are reminders that you have stepped out of alignment and that you can return immediately, without guilt and without resistance. The discipline of returning is deeply grounded in both psychology and spirituality. In cognitive behavioral therapy, the ability to interrupt a runaway thought pattern and shift attention is considered one of the most powerful tools for emotional stability. The brain cannot stop wandering, but it can be trained to redirect. Spiritually, the same principle applies. You will drift, but every time you turn inward again, every time you refocus on God, every time you breathe and open your heart for even a moment, you are reinforcing the neural and spiritual pathways that keep you anchored. Returning becomes a form of training that strengthens your awareness and deepens your connection far more effectively than trying to maintain perfect attention all day. One of the most freeing truths you can embrace is this: you don't return to God by force. You return by softness. Returning is not about pushing away your thoughts, but about stepping above them. It's not about wrestling with emotions, but about noticing they're pulling you and choosing another direction. You don't need long prayers or dramatic internal shifts. You need one simple moment where your heart whispers, "I'm here again." That quiet recognition breaks the momentum of mental noise. It interrupts the rising stress. It resets the nervous system. It brings the mind back into the present. It opens the inner space where awareness can settle again. The practice of returning becomes transformative when you understand that you can do it anywhere, at any second, without anyone knowing. In the middle of work, in the middle of a conversation, in the middle of stress, in the middle of noise, you can return with a single breath. You can return with a quiet internal posture. You can return with a shift in attention that lasts less than 2 seconds. And each return reinforces a powerful truth inside you. God was never gone. Your awareness simply stepped aside, and now you are stepping back. Gradually, returning becomes a reflex. Instead of spiraling into anxiety for hours, you recognize the first signs and come back before the emotion takes over. Instead of letting stress dictate your reactions, you interrupt the stress at its root and step back into presence. Instead of allowing negative thoughts to dominate your internal world, you redirect before they build momentum. This is where the discipline of returning transforms your entire emotional landscape. You stop being a victim of your inner noise. You stop being controlled by your thoughts. You stop being dragged by your reactions. You become someone who notices the drift early and returns before the day is shaped by disconnection. Spiritually, this is where the deepest transformation occurs. You begin experiencing God not as a distant presence you occasionally touch, but as a steady reality you continually return to. You stop feeling shame for drifting because you realize even the drift becomes part of your relationship with Him. It becomes the doorway that brings you back again and again. Returning becomes a rhythm that keeps your heart awake, and the more you practice it, the more natural it becomes to remain with God, not because your day is calm, but because your inner world is trained. Eventually, you reach a place where the drift is shorter, the return is quicker, and the awareness is stronger. You begin living with a quiet steadiness that others notice but cannot explain. You carry an internal stability that stays with you no matter what is happening around you. You move through your day with a grounded presence because you have learned the most important spiritual skill, not staying perfectly aligned, but refusing to stay disconnected. Practicing silent dialogue, remaining with God while engaging the world. There comes a point in your spiritual growth where you realize that the greatest obstacle to abiding in God is not busyness, but fragmentation. You can pray deeply in the morning and still lose awareness by midday, not because God left, but because your attention became divided in a way your heart wasn't prepared to manage. Most people live externally reactive lives while internally disconnected, switching between spiritual moments and real-life moments as if they were incompatible. But the truth is this: abiding in God does not require withdrawing from the world. It requires learning how to hold an internal thread of connection even while interacting with the world. This is the art of silent dialogue, the ability to carry a quiet awareness of God inside you as you work, listen, respond, decide, and move through your day. Silent dialogue is not about talking to God constantly. It is about keeping a subtle openness toward Him that runs beneath everything else. Imagine it like a second layer of awareness, a gentle background presence that stays active even while your main attention engages with tasks and people. Neuroscience calls this dual awareness, the capacity of the brain to maintain internal focus while engaging external activity. Spiritually, it becomes the foundation of walking with God moment by moment. The heart stays turned toward Him, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly and naturally. The same way you stay aware of someone sitting beside you even when you aren't speaking to them. The awareness is steady, soft, and continuous. Practicing silent dialogue begins by letting go of the idea that God must interrupt your life to be present. He doesn't need to compete with your responsibilities. He simply wants to be included in your attention. When you shift your inner posture toward Him, even slightly, even silently, you begin to carry Him into conversations, decisions, and moments where you normally feel alone. This inner shift changes your emotional tone, your psychological reactions, and even your physical state. You become calmer because you're not operating from isolation. You become wiser because your decisions flow from a grounded place. You become more discerning because your heart remains tuned to a higher awareness than circumstances alone. Silent dialogue does not require effort. It requires invitation. You're not trying to talk to God while doing everything else. You are letting God remain with you while you do everything else. The dialogue is not verbal, it's relational. It's the awareness that you are not thinking alone, not feeling alone, not deciding alone. You breathe, and inside that breath, you feel His closeness. You listen to someone speak, and inside the listening you sense His stability. You face a challenge, and inside the tension, you recognize His presence. The dialogue is not something you control. It is something you allow. As you practice this, a remarkable internal transformation begins. You start to notice subtle impressions, gentle convictions, waves of peace that rise at the right moment, clarity that appears in the middle of confusion. You begin to sense God speaking not in words but in awareness, in nudges, in quiet direction that guides you without interrupting you. And the more you pay attention to these subtleties, the stronger the internal connection becomes. The heart starts recognizing His movements intuitively. Your inner world becomes synchronized with His presence in real time. This practice also redefines your emotional experience. Instead of reacting impulsively to stress, you feel centered from the inside. Instead of losing your temper in moments of pressure, you feel a quiet restraint guiding you. Instead of drowning in anxiety, you experience a deeper grounding that steadies your breath and calms your nervous system. Silent dialogue allows God to shape your internal responses even while your external environment remains unpredictable. You become someone who carries peace rather than someone who searches for it. You become someone whose inner world informs your outer actions rather than someone whose outer circumstances dictate your inner state. The beauty of silent dialogue is that no one around you ever needs to know it's happening. You don't need to pause. You don't need to speak out loud. You don't need to withdraw. You simply maintain a slight openness toward God, like an internal window left unlatched. Through that opening, His presence flows continually, transforming how you think, how you react, how you understand, how you move. And gradually, your entire life becomes a conversation, a subtle but uninterrupted exchange between your heart and His presence. Eventually, this becomes the way you live. You stop compartmentalizing God into certain parts of your day. You stop feeling like you lose Him when you get busy. You stop needing to force awareness because awareness is already there, flowing beneath your tasks like a gentle river. Silent dialogue becomes your anchor, your rhythm, your stability. You begin moving through your day with a God-centered consciousness that brings wisdom into decisions, peace into pressure, clarity into confusion, and presence into every corner of your life. And this is where abiding becomes more than something you practice. It becomes who you are. Mastering inner stillness. When life pulls you into stress states, there is a precise moment when your connection with God becomes harder to feel, and it almost always happens before you even notice it. It begins in the body, a slight tightening in the chest, a faster breath. The jaw clenches a little, the shoulders lift. The thoughts begin to accelerate, one piling on top of the other, each thought creating pressure that pushes you further away from the quiet center you woke up with. This is the beginning of a stress state, and it is the exact moment when most people unknowingly disconnect from God. Not spiritually, but neurologically. The brain shifts from openness into survival mode, and survival mode silences subtlety. It narrows attention, it interrupts awareness, it blocks the sensitivity required to perceive God's presence. Suddenly, you're not abiding anymore, you're reacting. Inner stillness is not the absence of movement. It is the ability to remain internally anchored, even when the world around you demands more than you feel capable of giving. It is the capacity to step out of the storm of your own thoughts, even while your circumstances remain unchanged. You don't need silence to find stillness. You don't need calm environments. You need to understand how your body and mind work when they begin to spiral into stress, because the moment you understand these signals, you gain the power to interrupt them. And interrupting them is the doorway back into awareness of God. When your body activates a stress response, the brain's focus shifts to threat detection. That means your awareness narrows, your thoughts speed up, and your emotions intensify. In this state, the inner sanctuary you've built becomes overshadowed, not destroyed, but hidden behind layers of noise created by your own nervous system. This is why it becomes harder to pray when stressed, harder to feel God, harder to think clearly. It's not spiritual failure, it's physiology. Your nervous system is doing exactly what it was designed to do, protect you. But the problem is that it often reacts to internal pressures with the same intensity as real threats. A difficult meeting, a heavy workload, an unexpected conflict, a moment of insecurity. These create internal alarms that pull you out of God awareness before you realize it. Mastering inner stillness means learning how to interrupt the stress response at its earliest stage, before it gains momentum. The earlier you catch it, the easier it is to return to spiritual alignment. And the key to doing this is learning to recognize your own patterns. You begin noticing that certain thoughts are always the first sign, or certain emotions, or certain physical sensations. The goal is not to stop stress entirely. That is impossible. The goal is to stay conscious when it begins, so you can shift your internal posture before it takes over your entire system. The moment you notice stress rising, your greatest act of spiritual strength is not pushing forward harder. It is pausing internally. This is the art of stillness, a micro pause where you step out of the automatic reaction and back into awareness. A pause where you acknowledge what is happening without letting it own you. A pause where you open the space for God to meet you inside the tension, instead of waiting for the tension to end. This pause resets your nervous system. It slows the breath. It widens your attention. It softens your emotional intensity. Even a single slow exhale begins shifting your body out of reactivity and into openness. In that openness, awareness returns. Presence becomes accessible again. You realize God was never far. Your stress only created the illusion that He was. This inner pause becomes incredibly powerful when practiced repeatedly. The more you do it, the more your nervous system learns to remain regulated even under pressure. You stop being hijacked by your reactions. You stop losing spiritual connection during difficult moments. You stop being controlled by emotional spirals. Instead, you become grounded, steady, calm from the inside out, even while the external world continues moving fast. You become someone who carries stillness into environments that lack it, someone who can walk into pressure without losing presence, someone whose mind remains open enough to hear God even when everything around you demands urgency. Over time, inner stillness becomes a protective shield around your awareness. Stress no longer breaks your connection with God, but becomes the very moment you turn toward Him even faster. You become emotionally resilient, psychologically grounded, spiritually attuned. And the more you practice this, the less fragile your awareness becomes. You stop feeling like God disappears during difficulty because you begin experiencing Him most clearly when life becomes heavy. Stillness becomes your anchor. Awareness becomes your strength. Presence becomes your refuge. This is how you abide in God, even in the busiest, most demanding moments of your day. By mastering the internal pause that keeps your nervous system aligned, by recognizing the early signs of stress before they drown out your awareness, by remaining open to God instead of collapsing into reactivity. And as you grow in this, you discover something profound. Stress no longer pulls you away from God, it pushes you toward Him, recognizing the gentle pressures and invitations of the Holy Spirit. There is a kind of guidance from God that most people never learn to recognize, not because it is rare, but because it is subtle. It does not arrive with force. It does not interrupt loudly. It does not shock the senses. Instead, it comes as a gentle pressure, a quiet invitation, a soft inner movement that can easily be overlooked when the mind is too noisy or the heart is too hurried. And yet, these subtle impressions are often the primary way the Holy Spirit leads you through your day. The problem is not that God is silent. The problem is that modern life has conditioned you to expect Him to speak only in dramatic ways. Meanwhile, the Holy Spirit continues to whisper through slight nudges, inner shifts, sudden clarity, or an unexplained sense of peace that rises at the right moment. Recognizing these signals requires an inner posture that is both attentive and uncluttered. The Holy Spirit rarely confronts you through overwhelming emotion. Instead, He works through the quiet layers of your internal experience. You may feel a hesitation when you're about to take a step that isn't aligned with God's direction. You may feel a gentle pull towards something that didn't seem significant at first, but keeps returning to your attention. You may sense a small weight in your chest when your words are about to cross into territory that will wound someone. You may feel a wave of calm in the middle of chaos that feels out of place but deeply reassuring. These subtle movements are not random. They are invitations. They are the Holy Spirit shaping your awareness from within. But most people never notice these movements because they expect God to bypass their internal world rather than work through it. They wait for dramatic signs while ignoring the signs that are already present. They wait for loud answers while missing the small shifts of perception that carry more wisdom than they realize. Awareness of these signals grows only when you develop the sensitivity to notice what is happening inside you. This sensitivity is not emotional fragility. It is emotional intelligence guided by spiritual discernment. It requires paying attention to micro-changes in your thoughts, emotions, and physical senses, because God often speaks at the level of your internal responses. The Holy Spirit influences your thoughts in ways that feel like sudden understanding. A verse comes to mind at the exact moment you need it. A solution appears while your mind was still tangled. A sense of conviction rises not to punish you, but to guide you back into alignment. The Holy Spirit influences your emotions in ways that shift your internal state. Anxiety begins to settle without explanation. A burden feels lighter, as if someone took part of the weight from you. Your anger softens before you say something you'll regret. These emotional shifts are not coincidences. They are invitations to slow down, to tune in, to return your awareness to God. The Holy Spirit also influences the body in ways most people overlook. A sudden stillness in your breath, a release of tension in your shoulders, a feeling of warmth spreading through the chest. A quiet pause that interrupts your impulse just long enough for you to reconsider. These bodily cues are often part of the Spirit's subtle communication. Modern neuroscience acknowledges that intuition often shows up physiologically before it becomes conscious. Spiritually, this means God can guide you through sensations that your heart understands even when your mind has not yet translated them into words. Recognizing these signals requires a willingness to slow the internal pace just enough to observe them. You cannot hear a whisper if you are shouting internally. The more you practice inner stillness, the more perceptive you become. You start noticing when the Spirit nudges you to speak gently, to walk away, to move forward, to wait, to breathe, to trust, to let go. You start recognizing the difference between your own impulses and His quiet invitations. Your inner world becomes attuned to patterns that once went unnoticed. You begin realizing that God has been guiding you far more often than you ever recognized. As your awareness sharpens, sensitivity becomes strength rather than vulnerability. You become someone who perceives God in ordinary moments, someone who recognizes when to pause before responding, someone who senses when to intervene and when to remain silent, someone who feels when the Spirit is inviting you into deeper peace, deeper obedience, deeper trust. You begin to experience God not as a distant voice you occasionally hear, but as a quiet companion who walks with you, shaping your internal landscape gently, consistently, faithfully. Over time, these subtle signals become as familiar as the voice of a close friend. You no longer need dramatic signs to feel guided because your heart becomes trained to detect even the softest movements of God within you. You begin to live with a kind of internal confidence, not because you understand everything, but because you recognize the touch of the one who does. This sensitivity deepens your awareness, strengthens your spiritual intuition, and anchors your heart in a way that keeps you aligned with God even when life becomes chaotic. This is one of the greatest gifts of abiding, the ability to notice God not only in the extraordinary, but in the quiet, constant movements that shape your day. Once you learn to recognize these gentle pressures and invitations, your entire life becomes guided from within. You stop feeling lost. You stop feeling confused. You start walking with a quiet certainty that comes from knowing you are being led moment by moment, breath by breath, becoming a living atmosphere of peace in busy environments. There is a shift that happens inside a person when abiding in God stops being something they chase and starts being something they carry. It's subtle but unmistakable. Instead of entering the world and absorbing its chaos, you begin to enter the world and influence it. You become someone whose presence alters the emotional climate of a room the moment you step into it. Not because you're trying to be impressive, but because something steady, grounded, and deeply anchored in God radiates from you without your awareness. This is what happens when inner awareness becomes continuous. Peace stops being something you search for and becomes something you release. It becomes the atmosphere you bring with you into stressful environments, tense conversations, high-pressure situations, and crowded spaces. Most people walk through life absorbing whatever environment they enter. When a room is tense, they become tense. When people are rushed, they become rushed. When circumstances feel heavy, they carry that heaviness inside them. But those who abide in God begin to experience a different pattern. Instead of matching the energy around them, they become the stable point within it. The steady breath, the grounded posture, the quiet mind, the calm heart. People may not understand what they're sensing, but they feel something different in you, something safe, something steady, something peaceful. And this is because the internal sanctuary you've built isn't just influencing you anymore, it's influencing the world around you. Becoming a living atmosphere of peace begins with understanding that emotional states are contagious. Neuroscience calls this emotional resonance. The nervous system of one person can influence the nervous system of another without words, without intention, simply through presence. When your internal world is agitated, you spread agitation. When your internal world is hurried, you spread hurry. But when your internal world is anchored in God, your calm becomes grounding for others. Your steadiness brings relief. Your presence brings clarity. Your peace creates safety. People gravitate toward you not because you're extraordinary, but because you carry something their hearts are silently craving. This shift does not require you to be perfect or unshakable. It requires you to remain aware. When your awareness of God is continuous, your reactions slow down. You don't snap as quickly. You don't panic as easily. You don't absorb negativity as deeply. The way you see people changes because you are looking at them through a heart that is not overwhelmed. You start listening with patience instead of defensiveness. You start speaking with gentleness instead of tension. You start acting from wisdom instead of impulse. Your behavior becomes shaped from the inside out, and that internal shaping becomes an external influence. Even in chaotic environments, your inner stillness becomes stronger than the external pressure. Workplaces filled with stress no longer pull you into their emotional rhythm. Family environments with conflict no longer trigger the same reactions. Social situations with tension no longer disrupt your inner world. You carry peace like someone carries fragrance, silently, consistently, naturally. People may not articulate it, but they feel something different in your presence. They feel less rushed, less defensive, less anxious. And this happens because you are anchored in a deeper reality than the one they're reacting to. Becoming a living atmosphere of peace also changes how you approach challenges. Instead of reacting impulsively, you respond thoughtfully. Instead of letting fear dictate decisions, you choose from clarity. Instead of matching negativity with negativity, you offer something different, something stable, something rooted, something shaped by the presence of God within you. You begin to realize that the environments that once overwhelmed you no longer have the same power, because your inner environment has become stronger. God's presence inside you starts influencing your perception of external events. Your mind stops catastrophizing situations. Your emotions stop escalating unnecessarily. Your body stops staying stuck in stress responses. Peace becomes your baseline, not your exception. This transformation does not only bless you, it blesses everyone around you. People feel heard because you listen differently. People feel understood because your heart is open instead of guarded. People feel safe because you aren't reactive. People feel hopeful because your calm suggests something more is possible. In this way, abiding in God becomes a form of quiet ministry. You don't have to preach. You don't have to announce anything. You simply carry peace into places that lack it, and your presence becomes a subtle reminder of God's presence. Over time, you begin to see the ripple effect. Conversations soften, conflicts de-escalate, relationships deepen, environments shift, not because you changed them by force, but because you changed yourself through awareness, and that awareness changed the atmosphere through you. This is the fruit of abiding in God. You become someone who influences the world not through noise, but through presence. A presence that reflects Him. A presence that steadies others. A presence that brings peace where peace is missing. Eventually, you understand that abiding in God is not just about your own spiritual growth. It is about becoming a conduit of His presence in places that desperately need it. And when this happens, You stop living as someone shaped by circumstances and start living as someone who shapes circumstances with the atmosphere you carry inside you. The presence you choose becomes the life you live. There comes a moment, after all the searching, practicing, drifting, returning, anchoring, and awakening, when a quiet realization settles into your spirit. Abiding in God was never meant to be complicated. It was never meant to be something you chase with exhaustion or something you experience only in isolated pockets of your day. Abiding was meant to be your natural state, the internal posture from which your entire life unfolds. It was meant to be the foundation beneath your thoughts, the stability beneath your emotions, the clarity beneath your decisions, and the peace beneath every breath. And when this truth finally reaches the deepest part of you, something shifts. You stop striving to feel close to God. You start living from the awareness that He has been close all along. This awareness begins transforming you from the inside out. You start noticing that the moments you once considered small are now saturated with meaning. A quiet breath becomes communion. A pause becomes alignment. A simple task becomes an anchor. A moment of stress becomes an invitation. You realize that God has been woven into your daily rhythms for longer than you ever recognized. And now, with your inner sanctuary rebuilt and your awareness trained, you begin to see Him everywhere. In the spaces between thoughts, in the gentleness of a slowed heartbeat, in the clarity that arrives exactly when you need it, in the peace that rises before panic fully forms. The presence you choose, moment by moment, becomes the atmosphere of your internal world. It begins shaping your reactions, your resilience, your tone, your sense of purpose. You stop being someone tossed around by emotional currents and start becoming someone guided by an internal compass that always points you back to God. Your awareness becomes less fragile. Your connection becomes less dependent on circumstances. Your sense of God becomes less like a visitor who arrives occasionally and more like a steady companion who walks with you through everything. As this presence becomes your home, your entire life begins to change in ways that feel subtle at first, and then undeniable. You start responding to challenges with clarity instead of fear. You start moving through stressful environments with groundedness instead of anxiety. You start seeing others through a lens of compassion rather than irritation. You begin noticing that wisdom comes easier, patience lasts longer, and peace settles faster. Not because situations have become easier, but because you are no longer facing them alone. The presence within you becomes stronger than the pressures around you. This is where abiding becomes transformational. It stops being a spiritual concept and becomes a lived reality. You realize that every moment of your day offers you a choice to drift into the noise or to return to presence, to live from reaction or from awareness, to collapse into stress or to anchor into God. And every time you choose presence, even for a second, you shape the world you experience from the inside out. You choose the life your soul lives, and this is the profound truth that carries you forward. The presence you cultivate becomes the person you become. The inner sanctuary you build becomes the world you walk through. The awareness you protect becomes the peace you carry. And once you begin living from this place, there is no environment, no pressure, no responsibility, no moment of chaos that can pull you out of the God who holds you. You don't just visit His presence, you live in it. You don't just seek peace, you release it. You don't just experience God occasionally, you walk with Him. In every step, in every breath, in every ordinary moment that becomes sacred the moment you become aware. Abiding becomes your lifestyle, awareness becomes your strength, and God becomes the atmosphere within you that shapes the life you live. Not someday, not in rare moments, but every single day, exactly where you are.